And so what happens in identity politics, whether on the left and the right, is that you forget about trying to help everyone, you help just your group. And even if that group is legitimately marginalized, and I'm saying that these groups to some degree, I think are legitimately faced some difficulties, some on the left, even some on the right. But even if that's true, if that's your entire focus, inevitably you begin to punish other groups. And you forget to listen to other groups. And so what we don't find is solutions that can be accepted across the board. And identity politics moves you away from that rather than trying to figure out how can we find solutions where maybe everyone doesn't get all that they want, but we get enough buy-in from enough people across the board that we can walk in it together. And thus, identity politics turns into polarization. So it takes what I think should be a good instinct to help the marginalized, and then it turns it into this sort of drive towards polarizing and dehumanizing the other.
Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm your host, Walter Kim, NAE President. Here we share conversations to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, we're taking a fresh look at how faith, particularly Christian faith, has shaped our nation in both its strengths and its struggles, and how it might guide our future. In this series, we've explored America's religious roots and the significant ways Christianity has influenced our national story, from religious freedom to seasons of revival. We've also engaged in the more complicated and painful chapters of our past, knowing that facing them with honesty doesn't weaken our faith or the church. Rather, it strengthens our witness. Today, we turn to a timely and challenging theme, the tension between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the United States of America. We'll consider how this tension intersects with identity politics and shapes the way Christians engage in public life today. To help us think clearly and faithfully, we welcome George Yancey, a professor of sociology at Baylor University, whose research explores polarization, identity, and the ways believers can resist being discipled more by their political tribe than by Christ. George, thank you for joining us today. I have long appreciated your work, and it's a privilege to have you on this podcast.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to this conversation.
So, George, this has come in the midst of a series of conversations that we've been having on faith in America. And up till now, we've focused a lot on the history of the states. But in our conversation, I want to shift our focus a bit to look at what's going on now. And so as you look at this moment in American Christianity, given your expertise, your perspective, how would you describe the range of evangelical public engagement today?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think, it's been argued that evangelicals differ from fundamentalists in their willingness to engage society. Fundamentalists tend to pull away and create enclaves. Evangelicals engage. And evangelicals, and a lot of people think of engagement as just politics. And actually, evangelicals are not much more likely than other groups to engage politically. What they have engaged in, obviously, other ways, such as helping ministries and serving people and things of this nature. I don't see any evidence that the political engagement of evangelicals is any higher than it has been. What we do see, though, is voices seem to be louder. And I think the current political situation has lended evangelicals, those who want to engage politically, to take a more aggressive stance on this sort of engagement. So I'm not sure that there's more engagement. I think that the engagement has been, on the political area, has been much more louder and drawing more attention to itself.
George, just in that opening response, you've given us a lot of things to actually digest and then unpack. So let me draw something else out that you've alluded to right at the beginning of your comment, and that is the difference between political and public engagement that you
Hmm.
drew out.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit more? You alluded to helping ministries in other
Sure.
ways. So in your work and given your background in social sciences, um, what is a general social science way of understanding public engagement of any group?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the way I would define it is, do you engage the public outside of your subculture, of your group? So, it's not just internal, it's external engagement. And of course, it can be very political. I mean, that is a type of engagement. Not everyone gets involved politically. Not everyone votes. Not everyone gives money. But it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, we've known as social scientists for a while that religious individuals volunteer more, they give more money per capita, they, however you want to measure voluntary engagement with society to try to help people out. Church Christians have built schools and hospitals, and from what I've seen, evangelicals are more likely to do this than say mainliners, to sort of give their time, their money, their resources, engage in mentoring, these sort of things. So, engagement doesn't have to be just political. It's anytime you go outside of your group in order to try to have an impact on the larger society.
That's really helpful. And that's actually very encouraging, given the discourse that often surrounds religion in America
Yeah.
or evangelicalism in America, that there is this kind of disproportionate impact that evangelicals can have on public good. And that's been
Yeah.
a longstanding part of it. In terms of the ministries of evangelicals.
Yeah. The people doing the mentoring don't get the attention
Yeah.
that the people doing politics do. And so it's an unfortunate element of our news media, but also we evangelicals pay more attention to the political people than the non-political people ourselves.
Okay, so explain that phenomena. You said it's not evangelical engagement in politics is not any broader than in the past, but it's louder.
Yeah.
And help us understand why it is louder, why it's permitted to be louder, why it might even be accentuated and not just louder in terms of volume, but maybe even angrier than in the past. Like what explains that kind of shift?
Well, and once again, I don't have a way of measuring louder. This is sort of my impression of it, and I'm old enough to have seen some of these transitions go on. And I think the easiest explanation is 2016 and the win of Trump. And the reason why is that whatever else you want to say about Trump, and there's a lot of things you can say about him. Some people like him, some people hate him. He's so polarizing. Whatever you want to say, and I don't think this was an intention, but he played on themes that were more common on the left of identity politics.
Hmm.
And so when he won, I think some evangelicals, really about 10 years ago, there's all this talk about how white evangelicalism was dying out and there was, a post-Christian society. And I saw a post-Christian society coming, I think still is coming. And so evangelicals were not really that as loud because they probably didn't feel like they had a place that people would listen to them.
Mm.
Trump's victory gave some of them a feeling like, all right, people will listen to us now. And thus become much more assertive. One of the things I'm hearing today that I really didn't hear this 10 years ago was evangelicals arguing that to be a good Christian, you have to vote for Republicans. Uh, you know, yes, there's plenty of conservative evangelicals politically 10 years ago. That type of rhetoric was not very prevalent. It's much more prevalent today.
Hmm.
So I think the victory of Trump and the evangelicals who tied their wagon, I don't know how you want to phrase it, tied their wagon to him, however you want to phrase it. That I think emboldened them to be much more vocal, much more bold, much more willing to be aggressive in their political stances.
George, you wrote an article that sought to distinguish between conservative identity politics more generally, and Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And there's been so much discussion about Christian nationalism that it's almost become a given that this is a way of describing the religious landscape right now, the rise of Christian nationalism, the force of Christian nationalism. And you put a pause to that. You put a pause to that by saying something that I thought was very insightful and nuanced, to take a step back and say, what's really going on here? And this notion of a conservative identity politics that might be mirroring or be a reaction to the progressive identity politics. So before we get to the actual substance of your argument, give us some definitions. What is identity politics? What is this phenomena?
Okay, basically, identity politics is political activism based on the identity of certain groups. In other words, for the interests of those groups, that's what your politics is based upon. Now, that you could argue that we've always had some degree of identity politics. You could argue that back in the day it was based on people who are white. You could argue that. But what makes it different today is that it's based on groups being marginalized. So what happened was, and I'll spare you the whole history, but in around the 1960s or so, those on the left decided that we need to base our politics on helping marginalized groups, defined as racial minorities, sexual minorities, women, the poor, that sort of thing. And so the political activism was based on helping these groups out. What happened in 2016 was this began to translate into political activity with the definition of rights of men and of Christians being marginalized. And so they really adapted the tools of leftist identity politics and began to apply it to groups that were traditionally conservative. And in doing so, then, I think they've taken on the potential of identity politics to win political battles, because it can, but also the drawbacks of identity politics, which is to things such as seeking out heretics and dehumanizing your enemy and not engaging in the intellectual substance that you really need to do. So that's kind of what happened, and that's how I define identity politics.
All right, that's gives us a rubric to work with, an understanding, a framework of understanding. I want to push a little bit because on the face of it, it seems like concerns for the poor, the marginalized, are good things. Like to have those concerns. So
Yeah.
what takes something from a political concern for the marginalized, whether it was in the 1960s or in 2016, what moves it from a political concern for a group of people that you're hoping to represent to identity politics in a way that seems belligerent or ideologically narrow? So there's some added ingredient, it seems to me, that needs to be understood, that shifts it from a political concern to an ideological tribalism.
Right. Yeah. And I think the last word, tribalism, I think is where the problem comes. So, I think obviously groups that are marginalized, we should be concerned about them. I'll even go as far as to say that there are ways in which Christians can be marginalized in academia. I don't know how you cannot argue that Christians are not a minority group in academia. You could argue that, men have high suicide rates. I'm not saying that it's a woman's world, it's still a man's world, but I think that it's very fair to ask, why are men's suicide rates so high? What's happened in society? And sometimes that's not asked. So I'm saying, yes, we should be concerned about the groups. I think the problem is that before identity politics, whatever you want to say about things such as laissez-faire capitalism or Marxism, these are systems that purported to try to help everybody. And so what happens in identity politics, whether on the left and the right, is that you forget about trying to help everyone, you help just your group. And even if that group is legitimately marginalized, and I'm saying that these groups to some degree, I think are legitimately have faced some difficulties, some on the left, even some on the right. But even if that's true, if that's your entire focus, inevitably you begin to punish other groups. And you forget to listen to other groups. And so what we don't find is solutions that can be accepted across the board. And identity politics moves you away from that rather than trying to figure out how can we find solutions where maybe everyone doesn't get all that they want, but we get enough buy-in from enough people across the board that we can walk in it together. And thus, identity politics turns into polarization. So it takes what I think should be a good instinct, helping the marginalized, and then it turns it into this sort of drive towards polarizing and dehumanizing the other.
Yeah, it's turning what could have been a positive concern to a negative attack, right? So you have to define yourself against someone else, and makes it a zero-sum game.
It does.
To help this group of people, necessarily means other people have to be balanced out in that regard. And George, I really appreciated the fact that you mentioned the high suicide rate among men, or the ways that boys are lagging in schooling systems, the marginalization of certain conservative or religious perspectives within secular institutions, not just educational institutions that you come from, but institutions more broadly. And those are legitimate concerns. And yet, in advocating for those concerns, we've somehow forgotten, can we raise all the boats in the harbor?
Yeah.
Does it really require sinking another person's boat?
Right.
And it seems like we've gotten into that place. Your article, and we're going to include that in the show notes, took a step further in analysis by trying to differentiate between identity politics of a conservative sort and Christian nationalism. Why did you make that move?
Well, I think Christian nationalism, first, I think just in the public, Christian nationalism becomes what people want it to become. And even in academia, I think there's problematics with the definition of it in academia. There's a really good article on it by Jesse Smith on how the terms, can phase into different ways. And so I don't think it's that well defined, first off. But the degree it is defined, it's really based on this notion of a Christian superiority, that Christians are the superior group, and an authoritarianism that's there, and trying to set up a Christian government. And I'm not saying there aren't Christians that are that way. There clearly are Christians that are that way. But I'm saying is that's probably not the best way to look at the broader path of where conservative Christians who are politically active are on. They don't see themselves as doing that. And as academic, when I say, this is what you're doing, you say, no, that's not what I'm doing. I don't know if I have the right to say, well, yeah, you really are doing that. But if you ask them what they're doing, they see themselves as trying to defend themselves from oppression. Now, you're free to argue you're really not oppressed. I mean, I think that's a legitimate argument. I think there are issues that should be drawn. I never use the word, I won't say never, but I hardly ever use the word persecution in the United States because of its real meaning around the world. So I mean, you want to argue, look, you guys are off because you're really not that bad off. I think that's fair. But I think the way Christian nationalism has been used is to say, you guys are trying to take over society. To the degree that is true, you can also say that about the feminists. You can also say that about, the libertarians. They want to win elections and they want to set up a society that meets what they want. You can really say that about any interest group. But the whole Christian nationalism makes it seem like Christians are uniquely trying to take over society. And I don't see any evidence that that's really the case. What I do see evidence of is this sort of identity politics, that Christians feel they're marginalized and then they lash out of that marginalization. So I think it is an important distinction to make. It may be that whether you come from Christian nationalism or identity politics, you come on the same side of a particular issue. But how you talk to people about that issue, if you want to convince people, I'll just throw this out there. You may come on the same side on our immigration. You may come to a type of attitude that we got to, grab them up and kick them out. Whether you're Christian nationalist, I can see how you can make that argument to Christian nationalists or through identity politics. Now, how are we going to address people who have that idea? If you come at them and say, you guys are trying to do this because you want to set up some sort of Christian fightum, and that's not really their motivation, you have no chance of convincing them to rethink their ideas. however, their motivation is they feel a pressure, an oppression, and people are coming in, and it's going to get worse in their minds. Now you can start addressing them and addressing the ideas of where they're coming from, and you have a chance to help them see something different. So I do think, even though if people people may say, well, if they have this position on this issue, who cares why they do? If we want to have a conversation to convince them otherwise, or at least moderate it, then why they do it is very important. If we come to the conclusion the only way to do it is to defeat them politically and use power, then what we gain with power, we'll always have to hold with power. And so we better be prepared to do what we need to gain power. And as a Christian, I'm uncomfortable with coming to that position, because I think I've seen what happens when people feel like they have to hold the power no matter what.
George, I want to come back to that in a moment, of your discomfort with the use of power as a Christian. And I want to talk about Christian perspectives, what the kingdom is all about, and how it could play into this moment. But
let me clarify. I'm comfortable using power as the main way to get what you want. There are times where you do have to use power.
Yes.
So
all right. So we'll explore that.
Think that I never think power is necessary. Yeah.
Okay. We'll explore that in a moment. I want to maybe draw out how this applies in a progressive direction. So we've been thinking about the use of identity politics and some of these conservative ways. And that makes sense for perhaps the rise of certain segments of American evangelicalism. But I think the same could be said also of progressive American evangelicalism or progressive movements. And you alluded to that as an academic, of the pressures that one might feel, the marginalizations of that. So how are we to engage with progressive identity politics in similar manners that you have suggested for conservative identity politics? I mean, is it basically the same set of tools and practices of listening, or is there a different dynamic and a different set of issues that we need to be aware of that are so important to the advocacy and identity politics from a more progressive side of things?
Yeah, I think there may be some nuance and some differences, but I think that the basic tool set is the same. I think the way when I do my research, I see there were some slightly different ways it was applied with certain Christians and with the anti-racists. But the basic direction was basically the same. As far as dehumanizing one's opponents, seeking out heretics, that was tend to be very similar. And so I do think that we have, it's very fair for us to critique progressive identity politics just as much as conservative Christian identity politics. And what I would argue is, if we want to look at what's happened to the anti-racism movement from, say, 2020 to today, I think a lot of its downfall was it had this very hyper identity politics approach, which, to be honest, turned off a lot of people, and not just people who were far right wing. It turned off a lot of people in the middle. And so when people started critiquing, say, DEI or critical race theory, there wasn't a lot of defenders there, because some of the ways in which identity politics was used, the polarization, a lot of people in the middle just did not want any more of that as well. I think that's a caution tale, by the way, for conservative Christians who are engaging in identity politics. That they may have the political edge, but there's no guarantee they're going to keep it, especially if they are polarizing and alienating people who are neither their arch enemy nor their friends, but are kind of in the middle and trying to figure out what they want to believe. And then they're going to see some of the actions done by some of the conservative Christians who are engaging in identity politics.
Yeah, these pendulum swings that our society seems to be going through in these last several decades. And what's at stake is the character of what it means to be a Christ follower in the moment. What's at stake is the witness of the church in this particular moment. This is where I want to swing back to the comment that you made earlier about your concerns on the ways that we might utilize power. So occasionally, I hear you, power is necessary, the use of power is necessary, and it can be used to great good. So, George, you've done a lot of diagnosis right now. You've really helped us to understand some of the nature of the problem and why it's so concerning. Do a little bit of positive framing of where do we go from here. What do you think are the kingdom values, perspectives that would be so important for us in this particular moment?
Well, when I talk about racial issues, the scriptural framework that I use in order to see a way forward is the notion of human depravity. Uh, and to me, it is one of the biggest distinguishers between a Christian worldview and a secular worldview. Uh, the, in the secular worldview, if you looked at the Enlightenment movement and some of the humanistic movement, was the notion that humans are perfectible, that we could just find the right society and we could just find the right rules, we'll create some sort of utopia.
Hmm.
If you understand Marxism, you see that very clearly. But there's other versions of that. Uh, as Christians, as a Christian, I just couldn't accept that because I understood human depravity. And so once I understand that, it means that it's not just that human depravity and they are depraved. It's human depravity and I am depraved.
Hmm.
If I have that sort of humbleness, I can now enter into situations of I need to learn what you know, and maybe we can work together. So what I would say, rather than engage in a identity politics that is trying to gear us and send us away from working with others, to lean into working with others.
Hmm.
I would say that conservative Christians right now have a great opportunity because they do have political power. I mean, now is a time to invite people in to work with us.
Hmm.
Because when you're out of power, then they think that you're just coming here because you don't have power. But now you do have some power. And so to lean into this would be to let's work with people. Let's find solutions. Let's find reasonable solutions. Work with people who are reasonable. You don't have to work with the fanatics. Of course, you can't work with them. Work with reasonable people out there to find a coalition of moving forward. I think now's the time to do that. Not only would it help you to keep your power longer because you'll seem reasonable, but when you're out of power, people will realize what happened, and they may have a framework now to work with you.
Hmm.
So that's remembering who we are, and that we're fallen creatures, and using that first before we go on to critiquing other people. I think that's the big key to us trying to figure our way out of this.
Yeah, there's a little bit of irony. I asked you, can you give us some positive framing? And your positive framing is we're all
Human
sinners.
depravity.
Yeah, that's really rich. It makes me think of the verse though, your invitation to self-analysis in Jeremiah, where he says the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand that? And the invitation there to be suspicious of our own motives and to recognize as fallen beings, we all have questionable motives and we're all in this together. Mm-hmm. And if there is something unique and special about the gospel, as you articulate, well, it kind of begins with this notion of our corporate need for salvation and our corporate need to deal with our sin.
Yeah.
George, I'm going to ask you to build upon that. So let's take that as kind of a core, foundational conviction that we're fallen creatures, and that requires us to understand our own fallenness, the fallenness of others, and to have a base level of humility. What can we learn from one another? What is the further positive thing that would incentivize us to actually trust one another? So in other words, if we build this doctrine of depravity, why won't we just be left with a hermeneutic of suspicion all the time? I can't trust anyone. I can't trust myself. I can't trust you because we're all sinners here. So give us a little bit more that enables us to say, yes, of course we have to have this deep knowledge of our human depravity. But what would help us build trust beyond that depravity?
Yeah, I know it sounds really bad. Depravity, that's a great thing to understand. I see it's understanding the truth, but and part of it is, once I recognize that I have depravity, then I have more compassion for your depravity. Because I realized, hey, that could have been me, you know, acting that way or this way. And it gives me more, and I think this has been lost a little bit in our society, more of the capacity to forgive when I've been done wrong, because I realized that I could be the one who needs forgiveness later on. So I do think that it can, acknowledging reality can lead to a better place. I will say that once we realize that we're in this together, my approach when I enter into the conversations should be, as not always, should be one of curiosity. So if I'm with someone that I disagree with, and we've developed, and yeah, trust doesn't come instantly, but I developed some trust of them. Why do you think the way that you do? I mean, you seem like a reasonable person. Why do you believe this the way you do? And listening to people and being able to hear them out and understanding where they're coming from. Not in a way where I have to agree with them, but okay, now I see why you see things this way. And now we have a basis to work with each other. Will we ever have perfect trust this side of the grave? I don't think so. But we can get better once we understand each other. It's harder to dehumanize someone. And we know this from contact hypothesis. It's harder to dehumanize someone that we get to know. And that we understand. It's easier to dehumanize some blank face out there, some Antifa radical or someone wearing a MAGA hat. It is so easy to dehumanize those people because we know nothing out of them. We get to know why. Why is this person going to these rallies and yelling and wearing this mask and everything like that? Why is that person voting for a person? Why is this person a Christian voting for a person who seems so profane and celebrating them? Understanding a curiosity as to why that's the case, I think is something that we need. One of the things that I did after 2016, because I was confused, to be honest, is that I spent the past few months arguing why we should not vote for Trump. So I just said, I give up. I'm opening my Facebook page. Please tell me why you vote for Trump. I'm not going to argue with you. And it actually gave me some insight as to why people did it. It didn't mean that I still thought that was a mistake, but it gave me insight as to why people voted for Trump. And so I think that is sort of the attitude we need to have. And I would hope that some of the people who vote for Trump one day will want to know why I don't support him. And in an honest way. And if they ask me in an honest way, I will tell them in an honest way without trying to, say, wag my finger at them. And I can do that. But it takes someone who I feel who really wants to know why, rather than want to find a reason to attack me for why. And I think that's where we need to go. It sounds bad. Human depravity is our hope, but understanding it is understanding reality. Understanding that reality then can help us to have an appreciation for others, even those we disagree with.
George, this is really helpful because within the network of the NAE, I'm sure even within the listenership of this podcast, we'll have people who have voted in every direction. And maybe leaders who are leading organizations, denominations, institutions in which the deep tensions of the unwillingness of people to listen or have that curiosity is driving division. And yet we are called to something different as followers of Jesus, that takes seriously honest difference. Like we can't paper that over, but takes even more seriously our covenant responsibilities toward one another as fellow believers in Jesus. In addition to just being humans created in the image of God, the loyalty that we actually owe each other. I want to ask a question that deals with the nuance of how do we hold some things together. So you've written about the ways that identity politics gives people a sense of belonging and how powerful that is, because we all want to belong, and it could be instrumentalized by leaders in producing identity politics and giving us this deep sense of belonging, tribalism, etc. And yet the church also is seeking to create this sense of belonging. I mean, we have this all throughout Scripture, neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, our oneness in Christ, breaking down the dividing walls of hostility. So this profound sense that we are no longer strangers to one another. We are actually brothers and sisters. So how does the church meet this longing of belonging, like a desire to belong? How does it live out this deep desire to create this family? How does that happen without it slipping into a form of tribalism, whether it's political or social tribalism, so that the church all of a sudden becomes this club that defines itself against this increasingly secular, pluralistic society?
Yeah, I think if we really look at the true values of what it means to be a Christian, we'll create a community that is truly inclusive in the ways that it should be inclusive. Not sort of a blind inclusive where we accept everything, because there are things that obviously we should not accept. But inclusiveness as who you are, you can come here. But I think that really takes a sort of a radical, I don't mean this in a political way, but a radical way of understanding who we are as Christians. We are image bearers. It means everyone's an image bearer. And as an image bearer, that's how I should approach treating you. Either you're my neighbor if you're not part of my Christian walk, or you're my brother and sister. And if you want a place here, you can come here, warts and all, and we'll work together to you to help me and I to help you. That is exactly the sort of type of community that we should want to build. That is what's going to draw people to us if we build that sort of community. And is it going to reach everyone? No, of course it's not going to reach everyone. But that's where I focus. When we get too involved with politics, and I'm not saying church cannot be involved in politics whatsoever. We get too involved in politics, we start making lines of saying, well, do you really want to join here because you voted for so and so? And that should never be a part of our church. We can agree to disagree. Ultimately, and a lot of people have a hard time with this, ultimately politics are secondary issues to primary issues. And secondary in that I can accept people no matter how they vote as a brother or sister in Christ, and I can love and take care of that person no matter how they vote as a brother and sister in Christ. And once again, that doesn't mean we have to accept everything that comes in. And there are certain perhaps really disturbing attitudes or disturbing actions that, of course, we need to deal with as a community. But if we do that by remember that everyone's an image bearer and that we're to call on to love that person, we're to treat them as Jesus treated the Samaritans in his story of the Good Samaritan, the woman at the well. And if we did that, that's the sort of community that's the sort of inclusive community that we should be building.
George, as we draw this conversation to a close, given all your research on polarization, identity conflict, given your understanding of depravity and the challenges that exist, what actually gives you hope in this moment? What enables you to say, yeah, I actually see a way forward, and are people taking? What gives you hope in this moment?
I do think there are pockets of people who are doing as best we can the right way. And my hope is that over time those pockets are going to grow in influence. That as people get tired of the roller coaster of going from one group to another, that they'll want to build on serving everyone. Some of my work on racial reconciliation, I think that there's hope in that. There are, I meet people all the time, and I realize they may not be representative, but I meet people all the time who, I just want to go out and do what's right and love people. And I think that what will happen in my lifetime, I'm not sure. Maybe my boys' lifetimes. But I think we can build on that. And I do think the church is the hope, because I see that in a way that in the right sort of churches that I don't see anywhere else. So, at this point in time, I would just say find like-minded individuals and have community with them. and then invite others into that community. And let's just start from there. Let's not despise small beginnings.
That's a good word. George, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Walter. Pleasure meeting you. God bless.
Across our society, we see how political identity can quickly become a primary lens for interpreting the world, shaping our reactions more powerfully than Scripture itself. This pull is not limited to any one part of the political spectrum. Whether through conservative or progressive identity politics, the temptation is the same, letting our political tribe define our moral imagination. Today's discussion has invited us to ask a deeper question. What does it mean to belong first to Christ? As rhetoric around politics, religion, and identity intensifies, some voices portray Christian faith as a cultural threat. Others seek to merge Christianity with national power in ways that distort the gospel. Still others feel marginalized or unsure of whether they have a place in public life. In the middle of these tensions, Christians are called to something different, to reflect a hope that cannot be reduced to political categories and a love that seeks the good of every neighbor. As we approach our national anniversary, may this moment help us reconsider what faithful engagement really looks like in a world full of competing identities and pressures. We don't have to choose between withdrawing in frustration or doubling down on partisan loyalties. There's a better way, one shaped by the character, mission, and hope of God's kingdom. May we take what we've heard today into our churches, our communities, and our conversations, and allow it to form us into a people who approach public life with humility, courage, and a deeply formed desire to reflect the love of Christ.